when they showed me that they knew all of my thoughts and specific moments where we had communicated prior to this event that happened in Phoenix, Arizona, and also indicated that they have been a part, or rather, I have somehow been a part of their whatever it is that's happening here, whatever this connection is. Went through a lot of, really big ups and downs trying to figure out like what is the relationship between this ethereal spirit realm where I'm able to communicate with this non-local consciousness in this physical reality. How does this relate to UFOs? How does it relate to future humans, if it does at all? The more we talk about these things, and it hasn't been easy to talk about these things because it's so far outside of my, and I'm guessing most people's, sense of conventional reality. But the more we have these conversations and talk about these things, I think the more we can potentially start to get some level of understanding about what that connection might be.
And welcome back to another installment of Behind Greatness by Inspire. It's Luciano here, speaking as your host as usual. Before we get right into it, I would like to remind you, the listener, please share, like, review, comment, all the good stuff. This is what you have been doing, and our listeners have been doing the last 3 years plus. And we have been ecstatic about what we've been doing, and how we've been growing, and the people that we've been speaking with. So again, thank you to our regular listener. Thank you for your auditory companionship. Thank you for all your feedback and your sharing. And for the new listener, my future self shares that same gratitude. Last note on that, you can feel free to visit our website as well. We are a non-for-profit. We've been doing this 13 years. 13 years this year. The podcast for close to 4. So we are a non-for-profit. We're a registered charity as well. Go to our website and feel free to donate if you'd like. All the steps are there, clearly set out for you. And while you're there, check out our library of conversations. You won't be disappointed. You won't be disappointed. All right, here we go. So we have our next guest today. He is. I didn't ask you from where in Montana. Are you in Butte?
Yeah, that's right. Butte, Montana.
I never asked you. I just took it for granted. Okay. So that voice belongs to Michael Masters. Dr. Michael Masters is a professor of biological anthropology at Montana Technological University in Butte, Montana. His current research program centers on hominin evolutionary anatomy, human variation, archaeology, biomedicine, and investigating the UFO phenomenon. Regarding the latter, in 2019, he published Identified Flying Objects, a multidisciplinary scientific approach to the UFO phenomenon, which examines the premise that UFOs and aliens may be our human descendants returning from the future to visit and study their own hominin evolutionary past. In 2022, he published the Extratempestrial model, which analyzes well-documented cases of abduction and other contact modalities in the context of this time travel hypothesis and other theories to put forth to elucidate this complex and mysterious phenomenon. His most recent book, Revelation, The Future Human Past, again focuses on UFOs in the framework of this extratempestrial model, but in the format of a satirical time travel science fiction novel. Welcome to the show, Michael.
Thank you. Yeah, appreciate you having me on.
Well, thank you. We've been excited to talk to you. We've already spoken a couple of times already. Anyway, just to get to know you a little bit, and your slant on things. Wanted to also thank Bruce, Dr. Bruce Solheim, who's also been on the podcast, who put us together. That was very, very nice of him, because what I expect here is that you're going to be adding to the conversation that we've been having on the program, an exploratory one. Our listeners already know, and I think you have a feeling as well. Like we just want to explore the what ifs and the why nots from people who have been doing that actively anyway. It's like it doesn't make sense not to.
Yeah, that's a good approach to take. Yeah,
Yeah.
for sure.
And I'll tell you, maybe to kick us off here, or maybe not, who knows? Our first episode was with Enrico Colantoni, and he's a friend of ours. He's been with us for since the beginning, since the first day in June 2011, and he's an actor. He's a Hollywood actor from Toronto, and he and I have conversations quite often. And when we do, it's always about the what if, and that is what he practices.
Mm.
So as an actor, he's always practicing the what if. What if I'm this character? What if I am not who I am in the next hour and a half or 2 hours or day or a week or 3 months? Like he actively practices make believe to explore, to see how he can stretch himself.
Yeah, it's a great way of looking at it.
I want to talk about stretching. So, what does extratempestrial mean?
Well, yeah, I guess speaking of stretching, it's just stretching the way in which we've used extraterrestrial to accommodate a similar idea of something that comes from elsewhere, but focusing on it instead in the context of elsewhen. So I took the Latin root ter, which means earth. So extraterrestrial means outside of earth, and just pulled out the ter and plunked in the tomp, the word for time in the same language, just to make it outside of time. And there's other ways in which this has been articulated over the years. Extratemporals, chrononauts, UFO knots was used by Michael D. Swords in the 80s and 90s. So yeah, the idea's been around for a while. And in the beginning of my second book, I try to trace back the earliest incarnations of it, just to try to provide context, but also to show people that, it's not just me out there yelling into the wind, but there's a lot of other people who have been advocating for this for a very long time. Going back to the 40s was the earliest I could find, and people like Herman Oberth, I believe considered the father of American rocketry, General Hoover, obviously with high level clearances, also not just said that UFOs are time machines, but some of the occupants are even future humans. So when people like that are saying the same thing as authors, anthropologists, screenwriters, producers, podcasters, it's I think it's something to pay attention to.
I kind of asked you when we last spoke, how do you go from studying anthropology, to an active interest, a very active interest in the UFO question? And you said the question should really be, it's how did I get into anthropology from the UFO question?
Yeah, that's correct.
Explain.
Yeah, so I described the situation that happened at the beginning of my first two books, and it's very much in line. If your listeners want to circle back and listen to your conversation with Eric Wargo that just came out recently, he's obviously the one that wrote the book on this, but I consider it an instance of precognition. I've had dream precognition my entire life, but in this particular moment, when I was about 8 or 9 years old, I looked up and saw Whitley Strieber's book Communion on the living room shelf facing out, and had this sort of flash of light, and then this image that popped in my head that came along with some basic questions about whether or not this archetypal gray alien could simply be us. I noticed even at that primordial age, that if you look at evolution in a very simple 9-year-old brain context with early hominins, modern humans, and then this gray alien from Whitley's book cover, there's a very clear connection there. What I eventually realized were called synapomorphies, or homologous characteristics with regard to our bilateral symmetry, eyes, nose, mouth being the same places, ears in the same places, and all of those that perform the same functions. So really just it made me ask this question: is could they be us? And obviously, you have to be wary of confirmation bias, selection bias, and we're taught to do that with great scrutiny in going through the academic process in any field. So, being weary of that, I decided to pursue physics and astronomy to see if I could study these craft in the context of whether they could be time machines. And then, about late into my sophomore year, I decided to switch into biological anthropology, and investigate this more in the context of human evolution, hominin evolution over long periods, 6 to 8 million years since we became upright walking, bipedal, which is the trait that defines the hominin lineage. And it'd be hard up to find any case that didn't describe these entities as bipedal walking humanoid forms, in addition to some others. So just looking at all of these suite of characteristics over time, and I got more into the weeds with craniofacial anatomy. One of my main focuses in graduate school was hominin evolutionary anatomy and studying the ways in which the eye orbits interact with the neurocranium above and the face below, because our faces have been reduced and retracted as our neurocranium has moved out over top of our eyes and taken over the space where you can find what's called a supraorbital torus and most other hominoid and early hominin species, a brow ridge, which is really exacerbated in Neanderthals and Homo heidelbergensis and Homo bodoensis. So just looking at the suite of characteristics and how they changed over time between then and now, and simply projecting those forward, and there's really no reason not to, because the same trends have dominated the last 6 to 8 million years of hominin evolution, then if those trends continue into the future, we're likely to possess the characteristics that are so commonly described in cases of close contact with these beings.
You're the first person that we've ever heard talk about these things, talk about the evolution of past human being up until the very far future, and then back. What's been your experience as an anthropologist and studying archaeology in your field? What's been your experience being on the site, on the ground, seeing, witnessing, and studying what you've actually found, physically found?
Yeah, it's been pretty amazing. I feel fortunate. I'm not technically an archaeologist. I'm a paleoanthropologist, which means I get to work on archaeological digs in various capacities. And I jocularly mention how we would group ourselves as boners and stoners, and we would even have soccer matches where we'd square off boners v stoners. And in southern France, where I worked at this 150,000 year Neanderthal site, and we had some pretty epic matches, actually. It was pretty close between the two groups. But as a boner, we studied the evolutionary anatomy and also comparative anatomy. So we don't just look at us in particular, but also work with paleoecologists, paleontologists to try to map out what the environment was like at the time that our ancestors lived in these places, because they do change dramatically relatively short periods of time, at least geologically speaking. And then the stoners focus more on the lithic tools, which we didn't have until about 3 million years ago. But once we developed those, we can see this evolution that happens in the morphological characteristics of the tools as well. So yeah, working at archaeological sites has been a lot of fun. I worked at a 3.5 million year old Australopithecus africanus site, a place called Makapansgat, for 2 summers. And then the
And where was
Neanderthal
that?
site I mentioned,
Sorry, where
that
was that?
was it was in the veld, as they say, the bush of northeast South Africa in the Limpopo region, near a tiny little town called Mokopane, which was named after a guy who led a revolution against the Dutch invaders, and wasn't really successful. That's a whole nother conversation, but he did manage to escape, and they named the town after him, because they renamed a lot of the towns from the Afrikaans uh, Netherlands invaders to the people that led revolutions, and the process of renaming a lot of things. Um, so yeah, working at these sites has been fun, because I get to learn a lot about the stone tools too, and because each particular place has a very separate set of tools made by different people at different times. I've led some archaeological digs here in southwest Montana, and we find obviously completely different things than what you find at a Neanderthal site. So yeah, it's been really cool to get to experience the archaeology side of things, when what we mostly focus on is just the bones, what comes out. We study them, but to be able to be in the process of discovery, and to hold in your hand a stone tool that was, made 120,000 years ago and hasn't seen the light of day since, is pretty cool. And then still working with the skulls too. I got to hold what's known as Miss Plez. I studied her as part of my dissertation research. It's 3.5 million year old Australopithecus africanus skull that's so well preserved that you can actually lift off the calvarium at the top of the skull and look down in on the basicranium where the
Oh,
brain
wow.
sat all of those years ago. And just there's another one there where they matched it up with a leopard's front and back canines. So what they would do, we were prey animals back then. We were only about 3.5, 4 feet tall at the most, and they'd put their front canines into our eye orbits and then sink their lower mandibular canines into the back of our skull in the occipital lobe, and then drag us up into trees and snack on us, and then sometimes drop us down into places that became caves, which are really well preserved fossils from that same area of South Africa. So just being able to see all of that in the fossil remains is amazing.
You remind me, just a quick side note here. I had a call, this is a work call with a potential client in Australia, and we were comparing our climates and our wildlife. And I've never been to Australia. I'm obviously here from Canada, as you know. Um, so I told him about a story that that I heard from my cousin who was visiting at the time, just very recently, and there was a brown snake found in an office building downtown Melbourne or downtown Sydney. And so they had to evacuate the building. Then we looked up a brown snake, and this thing's one of the most venomous snakes on the planet. And so I told him about this, and so he said to me, he goes, yeah, the difference between Canada and Australia is that in Canada, human beings are the top predator. In Australia, that's not the case.
Yeah.
So
Oh,
you
for
remind me
sure.
about the leopard.
Same where I was working in South Africa. We had a leopard den only about maybe a quarter mile away down the main trail that we hiked to get up into the old growth forest, and a pretty sweet water slide that formed naturally through these rocks that you could slide down into a big pool that we eventually realized a 10-foot python lived in. But
Oh,
even outside of the python and the leopard, the neighborhood leopard, we had puff adders and black mambas, which can kill you in less than 2 minutes. So yeah, you definitely have to be aware of your surroundings. And it's not just, wild animals. Like we have to worry about malaria and various parasites and a lot of
sure.
violence that exists in uh, regions with tribal warfare where we have to work. So it's kind of a dangerous field, anthropology, or it can be at times.
It's funny that you mentioned um, the python or the snake and the leopard, because in a previous conversation, the last conversation you and I had, this is a little bit of out of context, or you gave me two animals, and you told me that the snake is the masculine energy and the feline is the feminine energy.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. No, it's interesting, and I mean, you can see that with a lot of animal species. I think we were also talking about the difference between the bonobos and the common chimpanzee, pan troglodyte, the common chimp that is run with a patriarchal society, and they're the only other animal species that's been observed going to war with each other. Whereas you
Mm.
have the pan paniscus, the bonobo chimpanzee, that have alpha females, and they're very much make love, not war type of species. They're constantly engaging in sex play and just rarely have fights. It's funny that if you look across the animal kingdom, you can see a lot of things about us reflected in other species, even closely related ones like our closest living relative, the chimp.
So I've seen enough. I actually I shouldn't say enough because it's never enough. I love animal shows, so I've seen enough of those battles happening in forests and jungles, and it's fascinating to me how they communicate. We're talking about the bonobos and chimps, for that matter. But back to felines, actually, because when we spoke, we had a video call, and one of your cats passed by, and you just mentioned your cat, and you said that they have a unique personality and they are lucid in a way that other animals aren't. So I want to believe you. I didn't grow up with cats and I never had a cat as a pet. Why do you say that?
Well, part of it's anecdotal from just personal observation. I've had dogs and cats my entire life. Also grew up on a horse farm and a pig farm and a cattle farm. So I've gotten to know animals in various capacities,
You're like old
and
McDonald.
wild animals. Like there's a yeah, I know, I'm a farm boy, I guess. But there's a group of mule deer and an elk that I've befriended out here where I live now too, and they just Yeah, they know what energy to trust, I think, better than a lot of people do, and dogs also seemingly have precognitive abilities too. They seem to know things right before they happen, and I can't back that up with any studies that I've done, but I did read this book. Um, I think it's called "The Brain is a Time Machine." I can never remember the guy's name. Bodhiswana or Bodhisama. I think that's it. Or something like that if you Googled it, if your listeners Googled it and they were interested. But it talks about the way that our brains work in response to the environment and how a lot of times we have insights into things before they happen, just as simply a result of evolving to have to interact with very fast stimuli that outpaces our brain's ability to typically deal with it. And I coined this term, maybe I didn't, but as far as I can tell, I did about 7 or 8 years ago, called biorelativity, where it seems a lot of animals probably, even though we see barn swallows flying incredibly fast and flies escaping fly swatters at a speed that seems mind blowing to us, they likely see the world in the same way that we do. It's very likely that they evolved to still have the same perception, and just we seem very slowed down to them.
Hmm.
I talk about that in a couple of things I've published in one of my books as well, because it would be really easy to test. I haven't been able to find any studies, but you could look at things like metabolic rate, heart rate, the eye's ability to perceive things, EEGs. If you can stick an EEG on a barn swallow, I don't know, but it seems like there'd be a lot of ways to test sort of the perceived flow of time among a lot of different animals, or at least ones that were close enough to us that we could use some of these technologies. And I think that's maybe one of the limiting factors, is that we just don't yet have the technology to do this across a broad range of non mammalian animal species. But it'd be cool to look at that, because I think it would really give us some insights, not just into temporal perception, but possibly even pre-perception, precognition, the ability to respond to stimulus before it even happens. And I do think, and maybe it's an aspect of the fact that we've domesticated dogs and cats to such an extent that they've evolved more recently with pro-social behaviors in the same way that we have. So we've maybe instilled some extra abilities onto them that you might not see in their wild counterparts.
Oh, that's very interesting. I didn't think of that. We've overlaid something in our own domestic training for them to suit our needs. We've overlaid some skill set that
Yeah, it
we've.
might not be of any use to them in the wild, but and dealing with humans, which is the main way in which they get food, especially the little purse dogs that couldn't go out and hunt an elk by itself. Yeah, we may have given them some abilities that they might not have had otherwise.
I'm fascinated by the feline. Not to keep pushing this because I don't want to push it, but I am very fascinated by it because quite simply, the dreams that I have about feline beings, so lions, I mean lions, leopards, jaguars, panthers, are very similar to what others have dreamt about that who have shared these dreams with me. There's always something. There's like an extra perception involved in the dream with a feline. It's always just very very consistent.
Yeah.
And we've had some people on the podcast share some of their dreams on felines, but there's something there. There is something there about the feline.
Yeah, that's interesting. It's probably at least a part of why the Egyptians were so obsessed with them, is they realized maybe a divine spirit that exists in cats that you don't find elsewhere. They are pretty amazing creatures. I'll admit that. I've always been a dog person, but I'm kind of coming around to the other side recently.
Coming around. Well, I'm less a dog person, more a wolf person. I love wolves
Mm,
and how wolves hunt, communicate, live, and how
yeah,
intelligent they are, how wise they
yeah,
are.
they're amazing.
So I listened to a few other podcasts, a few other interviews that you've given, and you've given, by your admission, you've given hundreds of interviews. I think a year at some point, hundreds per year.
Yeah, on average, probably close.
Why don't we go to this? Because you've also admitted to me that, and I'm sure I'm not the only person you've admitted it to. You were sick and tired of doing this, of all these interviews, and then you kind of broke down, but you had an experience that encouraged you or urged you to not give up. You want to share that?
Yeah, a very brief version, I guess, because
Yeah,
it's a
yeah,
really
brief.
long story. Um, Maybe you could put a link to a couple resources where I tell the story in more detail in the
Yes.
show notes or something. But yeah, no, it wasn't just the pod interviews. I was traveling a lot for conferences and TV shoots, documentary shoots, and it was exhausting because I have, a full time job as a professor with all of the obligations, service, research, teaching. So yeah, I was just really burnt out. Decided I was going to quit this particular area of research to focus on some other things. Just had that thought in my head, and then I was taken by an individual at a conference about 2 weeks after that, probably, up into an empty room at the conference hotel, who brought another person in, a man who the two knew each other, but they'd never met before face to face. But he comes into the room and then pulls a chair up really, really close to me. So his face is probably like 10 inches from mine, and looks at me in the eyes and calmed me down at first because I was kind of pissed about how close he was sitting. But then these others, as I've come to know them, said through him, we know you've been thinking about quitting lately, and we'd really prefer you didn't do that. And it, blew my mind wide open because I hadn't told anybody that. It was just a thought in my head that I'd had about 2 weeks before. And yeah, it from that point on, there was a lot of other things that took place. And eventually, as I've said before in a couple different places, eventually and slowly, to the point where I hardly even noticed it, the entire conversation turned completely telepathic. So we weren't using our voices anymore, but I could still hear their voices, this woman and this man. And it wasn't them talking to me. They were being used as like a vessel of sorts. What I've come to understand is a form of trance mediumship. But they were brought to this place. They brought me up to this place and then had an intervention of sorts. They politely asked me if I would continue doing this for a while. They eventually told me they wanted to put 3 bits of information in my brain that would be important for some future events. Very politely asked me if I consented to that, explained exactly how it would happen, and then it happened exactly how they said it would. Um, just kind of blacked my eyes out and then force fed all of this information in the form of sort of colorful light into my brain, and also told me I wouldn't have access to it, asked me if that was okay as well, and I agreed to that. And that's been the case. I have no idea what it is. I can't access it, don't really want to access it because I don't want to know the future, especially because I get the sense that there's something coming. A lot of people who have experiences similar to this, and since I've started talking about this recently, so many people have reached out to me and described very, very similar things that have happened to them. And a lot of them have that same sense too, that it's in preparation for something. I don't claim to have any prophetic knowledge. In fact, I'm telling the opposite. I have no idea what it is they put in my brain, but I
Hmm.
do get the sense that there's some reason, which is largely why there was an intervention in the first place, perhaps.
Why did you consent to that information downloaded if you don't want to access it? What was it about it?
I realized the import and the fact that they organized that entire thing and not and did so in a way that made me sit up and pay attention because they knew a thought in my head. And then, not long after that, they referenced um, what I thought was just a crazy conversation happening with my internal monologue. They referenced it, that happened probably 5 or 6 months before, and again, just thought to thought, telepathic communication that I'd never experienced before. But when they showed me that they knew all of my thoughts and specific moments where we had communicated prior to this event that happened in Phoenix, Arizona, and also indicated that they have been a part, or rather, I have somehow been a part of their whatever it is that's happening here, whatever this connection is. Went through a lot of, really big ups and downs trying to figure out like what is the relationship between this this ethereal spirit realm where I'm able to communicate with this non-local consciousness in this physical reality. How does this relate to UFOs? How does it relate to future humans, if it does at all? So there's just a lot of questions that I'm still trying to figure out. I don't claim to have any answers, but the more we talk about these things, and it hasn't been easy to talk about these things because it's so far outside of my, and I'm guessing most people's, sense of conventional reality. But the more we have these conversations and talk about these things, I think the more we can potentially start to get some level of understanding about what that connection might be.
Well, you're so very direct in the language that you use. I mean, you don't pull punches, and you're very matter of fact in your delivery. And so you make what you sound so much more credible, as just like a piece of discussion. And this is not.
Well,
And I'm
speaking
not.
of that,
Sorry, go ahead. Go.
speaking of that, they did that on purpose too, because they involved other people in this experience. It started out with just this man and this woman who
Hmm.
were being used as the conduit for this event to take place. But slowly, we were in a public room where this pre-party had started out earlier, in this fourth floor room with a balcony in this conference hotel, and people were coming up the entire time. Three people even came out on the balcony, and these others, had them go back in. And even one guy I talked to who was in there, a lot of them were worried about me because they saw this man like right in front of my face. My eyes were wide open. I couldn't even move my head. They were witnessing all of these things and were worried. Like, what the hell's going on with Dr. Masters out there? He hasn't moved in arguably 30 to 40 minutes. I lost time for a while when they blacked me out, so I don't know exactly how long. But when they did bring me back, that room was full of people. So there were a lot of people that witnessed this. As far as credibility goes, like, it's one thing for me to say, I felt like I had a conversation with them earlier in the year. It was just me and my dog out there. But when a lot of people, two people were very intimately associated with this event, and then probably 15 to 20 people on the inside watching it. And one woman, I have no idea who it was. I couldn't lift my head because it felt like a bowling ball. But one woman put her hand on my arm and said, "Are you okay?" Because they were concerned. So it's something that involved a lot of witnesses. I got the sense they didn't really like that. They were trying to kind of hurry along a little bit more once
Yeah.
people started showing up in this room. But yeah, it's definitely, it's something I talk about matter of factly because it's a factual experience, and I don't really have the ability to fully comprehend it or even moderately comprehend it right now. So all I can do is say what happened, and then people can take that and make their own interpretation of the events as they unfolded.
Are you still in contact with those two people? Are they colleagues of yours? I never asked you.
No, they were just the woman who was standing to my left, who was also involved telepathically. All three of us were communicating in this way. But again, it wasn't us. Through these two people, I was communicating with these others. But the woman I did know from the same conference 3 years earlier when I was there, the man was a complete stranger. So to have a complete stranger come up and tell you something that was an intimate thought in your head less than 2 weeks prior was a very good way to get me to wake up and pay attention. Like, okay, what's going on here? So yeah, I've been in touch with them a few times since. We even all got together and recorded a little podcast just to kind of hash out what each other's experience was.
Hmm.
Like I said, one of the people that was inside the room reached out to me to kind of relay the oddities of his experience as someone who was separated by a glass door. So yeah, I've been in touch. I've even been in touch with these others about 6 or 7 times since then in various capacities. So it's an ongoing thing for sure.
When you say others, who do you think they are? What do you think they are?
I have no idea. The best I can do, yeah, the best I can do is some sort of highly evolved consciousness, non-local consciousness that is potentially associated with I don't know. I honestly don't know. They alluded to being future humans because when they asked if I would not quit doing the stuff that I was so exhausted doing, I said, "How can you possibly know that?" And this is where it gets kind of weird because I, the first time in my life, communicated telepathically as a question, future humans, without even opening my mouth. And I don't know if they put that thought there or if I just thought it and it came out somehow. But then they sort of took that and moved on. They didn't say, yes, we're future humans, but there was an implication of sorts, or they alluded to it. But I don't know. I wouldn't even begin to know how to put what this thing is that's able to know our thoughts and do things like partition part of my brain and put information in it that I don't have access to, and how that relates to UFOs and future humans. I have no idea. So I'm not comfortable saying that's what they are because they didn't confirm that. They just alluded
Sure.
to it. And without a more definitive answer to that question, I don't really want to speculate on it.
Yeah, yeah, for sure. But it's nice to think about it. What about your colleagues? What about your colleagues at the university? Do you get any pushback? Do you get any criticism?
Maybe secretly behind my back, but outwardly everyone's extremely supportive. I mean, nobody ever knows what people say behind closed doors, but I've
Sure.
had a strong research and scholarship program. I've earned grants. I've published in well-respected journals. And so when I transitioned more to this UFO question, I also did so in a way that was highly scientifically fastidious, where I
Hmm.
make arguments that are difficult to refute because I'm not saying anything that's speculative. It's just what we know based on our modern understanding of anthropology, astrobiology, physics, and astronomy, largely, and other fields as well. So if they bother to look at it and pay attention, they'll realize that it's done in a very responsible way without a lot of hyperbole and speculation. Um, but no, like,
Eh,
and a more how would I say manifested form. I've actually been extremely supported. I was given sabbatical last year to engage in a lot of the same research and go on these film these documentaries, TV shows, and publish another book. And they gave me an award as well. I got a research and scholarship award right before I went on sabbatical, and the vast majority of the research I was doing was related to UFOs. So that they're aware, and this was from the dean's level of our college. So yeah, there's definitely
Very
um,
cool. Very
overt
cool.
support. Yeah, no, it's good. I remember actually when the first book came out back in 2019, I was going up for to receive a 10-year service award, and the chancellor of the university had just seen an article in Fox News about that book coming out and what it was about as a featured article. And yeah, shook my hand and said, "Hey, I saw a story about this work in Fox News. Congratulations." So yeah, from the very beginning, it's always, at least so far, has been extremely supportive.
Well, you use the word fastidious, and that's a perfect adjective to the experience I'm getting by reading through your book, the Extratempestrial Model, because you talk you put out there case studies, several case studies, I think a dozen case studies here, and you introduce a very rich discussion based on your scientific background for each of these case studies. And again, I can't pretend to have read the whole book just yet because I'm going through it, but you're making links throughout. You're creating, or you're digging out for the threads with all these
Yeah,
experience in these case studies in a very functional manner, actually, very functional manner, which is really cool because it brings
yeah.
relevance.
Thanks.
Sorry, go ahead.
I was going to say thanks for noticing that because it was really hard to do. Because you see how these are connected in certain ways, but you have to introduce ones before you can tie them back. And because I did it in chronological order, a lot of times there's something I would want to tie in that I have to wait to get there to tie into the
Yeah.
earlier one. So I'm glad you noticed that. It was a chess game trying to put those together. I'll tell you what.
Yeah, yeah, no, I could see that that's not easy because you also have to create a lot of context beforehand when you're introducing these case studies, and it's wonderful. You
Yeah,
you also mention the Free Foundation quite a few times here, and um, those people are some of my favorite people. Ray Hernandez, Mary Rodwell, and now Rudy Shield have all been on the podcast, and they've done really cool work. You've studied it much more than I have, obviously, because
Yeah.
reading through your book, I can see that you did. You
It's a big book. Yeah, it's a really big book, but there's a
It's like
lot of good
1,000 pages.
information in there. Yeah, it's huge.
um, so we talked about it at length in the podcast as well. So we're not going to go into that. But I mentioned that also because I want to tie it to something else that you said on another podcast. I'm sure you said it many times. It's clear that there is an alien hybridization program. And this is something we've only heard from Rudy Shield so far, who's on the podcast a few weeks ago, the astrophysicist
Well,
from Harvard.
not
Tell me.
necessarily. Yeah, it's Gary Nolan at that SALT conference alluded to that as well. No, I'm pretty sure he said more or less that same thing in so many words. I don't think it was exactly stated that way. And I try to avoid the word alien too, because it's kind of been muddied over the years and
Yeah,
intentionally in many cases as part of this disinformation campaign that's very well established.
for
It's not
sure.
conspiracy theory to say that, but yeah, no, that's the most ubiquitous thing across all these cases. The extraction of sperm, egg, fetuses are put in, taken out. There's case after case. And the first time you hear that, you're like, that's insane. There's no way. But then you see it come up again and again and again in cases with very reputable people who have no reason to make it up. In fact, most of the time, they don't even want to talk about this because they sound as crazy as I probably just sounded when I talked about my experience. And it's nowhere close to as crazy or as elaborate or as outside of our conventional realm as something like being taken and abducted into a craft and having your gametes extracted. But then, yeah, you have cases like Terry Lovelace, for instance, where there's these incubation chambers just lining the walls of this massive ship, and he sees aliens, what he thinks are aliens, but then he's like, oh my God, he even drops an F bomb in there in his audiobook, at least. And he's like, these things are human. And he just can't believe it. He's like, well, they're not quite human. They're not quite like these grays or anything. But yeah, I mean, you read that enough and you start to recognize that at least for a period of time, Whitley Strieber was involved in this program and seems to think it ended or at least tapered off in the 1990s. And I've heard a lot of other people say that as well. But clearly for some time, they were extracting our DNA for a number of potential reasons, and I try to discuss those in the both books, the first one and to a greater extent the second one, because some other things I became aware of them as potential explanations for why this has been happening for decades as well. But I can't know. I obviously can't know until they tell us. But it's just some things in the same way
Sure.
that the first book focuses on long-term evolutionary trends. The second book also focuses on trends and what's been happening and focusing on patterns and what we can identify in these patterns to potentially learn more about their intent and also their origins.
Do you think your university would be open to the idea of having an undergraduate studies in ufology?
I don't know. Another thing I forgot to mention when you asked about institutional support was that in 20, I'm going to say it was crap. I don't remember if it was pre or post COVID, but it was either 2020 or 2021 maybe. I was actually asked to teach the honors class um about the subject. The whole idea, I was asked by the head of the honors department if I would teach a class that centered on the first book, because it is a more hard science book.
Mm.
And I intentionally did that to bridge this gap between ufology and my academic colleagues who require that to take it seriously. But I also wanted to make it readable for everyone. And I've been told it's dense, but if you look up some words, you can follow along. And then the second book flips the script towards the stories that you can just put on the audiobook and listen to. And, you don't have to look up as many words, but it brings the science into that. But prior to that book coming out in 2022, so it might have even been 2021, they asked me to teach a class where the idea was that each chapter in that first book would be a separate week. and we'd sort of break down the science behind it and look at how this might relate to the UFO phenomenon, not just in the context of time traveling future humans, but the other hypotheses that are put forth as well. Because I do talk a lot about the extraterrestrial hypothesis in the earlier chapters of that book, because it's kind of been the dominant mantra for so long.
Are you being asked to expand that out or to teach that course again?
I couldn't have done it at that time. I didn't have the time
The
for it. I
bandwidth. Yeah.
thought it was cool that they asked, and I wanted to do it. And I've never revisited it since. Might be something to look into. Because yeah, I think it would be really unique. There's not a lot of classes about UFOs anywhere.
No, I say this really for two reasons, and the second one just popped into my head now. It's we had our discussion with Diana Pasalka here on the podcast, and we talked a lot about the research and the work that she put behind that first book, American Cosmic. And since
Mm-hmm.
then, so a year later, so this past November, she came out with the second book, Encounters, that Netflix also did a series based loosely on her work, and she was a consultant. But anyway, she told me, because she's got 5 kids, and she was surprised when she came out with this book that her kids were not embarrassed at all. They were really into it, and so were her kids' friends. All these teenagers were really
Yeah,
into the message, and I found proof in that personally. My kids enjoy the books. Um,
that's
because
awesome.
it's a blend of science and storytelling in order to actually relate to the science
Yeah,
and to the research. Yeah, and she's a university prof as well.
yeah, it's good to have that both of those things, and that's why my first book has been dubbed dense and kind of a slog at times. I'm not selling it very well here, but it's good for people to know what it is. And a lot of people like that. Like if
Yeah,
you have a physics background or an anthropology or astronomy background, then it's really. I grew up loving. I couldn't get enough of books like Igor Navakov's The River of Time and Kip Thorne's Black Holes and Time Warps. I was consuming those like there was no tomorrow. So some people are into that stuff, and it was cool to write that first one for people like me, even kids. One of the first talks I gave was up in Lewiston, Montana. Lewiston, Montana. And they actually say Lewinton. It's a hotly debated topic, but it's right outside of where Malmstrom Air Force Base was, where they shut down 10 nukes in synchronicity there, one
the
after another.
UFOs, you mean?
And yeah. Sorry, the UFO or a UFO. I don't remember how many were there, but it was in this like really beautiful historic library up in the ballroom area of it. I guess they don't have ballrooms at libraries, but whatever you would call like the common meeting space. But as I
Hmm.
was getting ready to give the talk, I was downstairs and there was an 11-year-old kid checking out my book as I was like getting ready to go up and give this lecture. And I was like, hey man, come up, have a listen if you're interested in this. And just to see that, was
That's
a
awesome.
good introduction into the public conversations that were taking place. But
Yeah, that's great. It's great to see that there's a stigma that's melting away. It seems that way. Um, but yeah,
yeah,
this
it
younger
does. It
generation.
does for sure.
So Rudy Shield proposed, because he was vying to get onto the committee that evaluates new undergraduate degree programs, and he was proposing
Hmm.
that Harvard come up with or design, excuse me, not come up, but design an undergraduate degree on ufology. And his argument, he says, is
Oh
very
wow, that'd be
simple.
awesome.
Yeah. So he said it this way, or this is the way he explained it to me. I really like his style. He says, does Harvard want to be the first to have this program or the last? And so they voted him down, but it was surprising. So there's
That's
one
too
last note
bad.
in this.
I'm not surprised though.
Yeah, of course. But that's why I asked you about your university, because
I
they
mean, these
seem
are
to
the same
be
people
so.
that went after John Mack and yeah, no,
Yeah,
they are. Absolutely. But that's different. I mean, that's going to garner so much attention from the media and people we're
sure.
not quite there yet. Like the stigma is waning. And yeah, that'd be a very progressive thing to do and historically it's potentially the right thing to do, like to be on the right side of history because these are real. Whether, you buy into the hybridization, or you're not quite comfortable yet. It's not even about a belief system. It's whether you take seriously the people that have had these encounters and what they
Yeah.
describe over and over, whether you're at that level yet where you're able to process that and accept that. That's up to each individual, but you cannot deny that UFOs are real. So if you want to start simple, what are UFOs, or how do we understand UFOs, or what is the UFO phenomenon? Just keep it real vague in your description. That way you don't garner the negative publicity that still comes with people having these hang-ups that are the result of manufactured stigma that goes back to the 1940s.
This is the part of this kind of discussion that really intrigues me is the connection with the non-physical, the non-local consciousness, the download of
Yeah,
information, the telepathic
me too.
communication. Because that really, that's where we can find answers. Like what I asked you before, and it was, the old me would have asked you the same question. Why did you? The old me would have said, why did you consent to this information if you didn't really want it? Like, come on, that's what I would have said. Now I say, why did you consent to that information, even though you didn't want it? What's up with your mind frame about wanting that information? Right? Like it's it's the same question, but with a different intent.
I see. Yeah, and that's kind of how it was for me. It was almost like, well, they were very polite, as I've mentioned before. It was the
Sure.
nicest way they could possibly ask, and it seemed like I had volition. I could have said no,
Mm.
arguably, but they presented themselves in a way that made it very not difficult to do that, but almost uh, like there was some sort of duty. Obligation seems like the wrong word, because I didn't feel like I was being forced into it, but they I guess, let me put it this way, they did a good job creating an awareness in me about the fact that, with if they even have the ability to know my thoughts and to control people, to take over people and manipulate them, like they did with the women that came on the balcony, or as I found out later, the people that they sent there to do this. If they are able to do things like that, and then you start looking, yeah, like Diana Pasulka's work, and my most recent book gets into this a lot, that we see things like that happening throughout antiquity. And we can kind of understand them in the
Mm.
context of the weirdness of it being interpreted as religious phenomenon and spiritual phenomenon in Eastern tradition. So this isn't anything new. This kind of stuff's been going on for a long time. And I guess they did a good job presenting that holistic connection, not just in my own life, but with regard to the role that consciousness plays in our physical reality. It led to a lot more questions, but they presented it well at that time, to where I felt safe and comfortable. There's very much a group mind, almost hive mind aspect to it, where I was brought into that world to some extent. It wasn't just forced onto me, but I was almost brought into it to see the bigger picture for a brief period of time. But much like an intense acid trip where you think you have everything figured out, you come out of that and it's like, well, shit, I have absolutely no idea what any of this is, and only have more questions than answers now. But in that moment, there was a level of lucidity that allowed me to kind of see deeper into that, which also played into the acceptance of what they did in that moment.
You're drawn by mountains. We
And
talked about
beaches.
mountains and beaches. Okay. Well, I don't have a question yet prepared for beaches, but let's talk about mountains for now, and maybe one will come to it. You said you're always drawn by them, and you used to ski a lot, or you still ski, and you said you used to have bad dreams about not skiing when you were in Ohio. Um, I, I have a similar feeling when I'm around mountains. It feels like they are speaking, like they feel like they have.
Yeah.
Well, here's the question to you: are mountains beings? Are they alive?
Oh man, I don't know. I mean, oh, it's interesting too, because one of the basic definitions of a living form is, can it reproduce itself, which is why we don't consider viruses living things. And I found out that's quite contentious recently. But also,
Mm,
life is an entropy reducer. So it takes chaos and forms something more patterned. And in a sense, mountains kind of do both. They destroy, but they build. subduction leads to orogeny. It's one of my favorite phrases from geology. So I don't know. I guess the deeper question would be like, is rock alive? And
Nah.
I think I would differentiate between being alive and having some sort of energetic relationship to other things. But that would require us to expand our definition of what biological life is. So no, in the context of how we define life in biological terms, I would say no. But if we look at the energy that things possess and exude, and mountains certainly do that, I would say that they do have a sort of power, if I can use that word as a bit of a scapegoat to the question.
What I do sense in layman's terms, because this is the only terms I know, so you have to excuse me, is they have a sound. They seem to have a sound, and that's why I say alive. You're obviously much more eloquent and researched and knowledgeable in how you responded to that. But just in simple terms, for me, it really does sound it. It really does feel that they have a sound that I can't tap into, but I know that it's there.
Yeah. And what is sound other than a form of energy, a form of wave energy? And yeah, I mean, I think that's what we're kind of talking about earlier with the animals and how other animals might be more in tune with that. Maybe, there is something happening with regard to, there obviously is with like plants and animals. I just saw this cool clip the other day where David Attenborough hooked up a speaker to a flower, and they changed their frequency and amount of vibrational energy that they give off based on whether a bee has already taken the pollen from the flower. So they've developed this energetic relationship, and you can hear it. You can hear it change as the bee gets closer. The energy of the flower changes, and then its entire pitch and tone changes once the bee leaves to signal to other ones. And things like that probably exist all around us, but we aren't necessarily tapped in
We're
the
not
way
attuned to it.
that, yeah, we're not attuned to it. And maybe it's the same thing with the mountains and beaches. Maybe there's
And
something
beaches.
about that. A beach is a little more intuitive because it has the wave sound and
Sure.
water, and there's something comforting about
Yeah.
that.
What's a
But
beach
no,
without
I would
water?
completely agree with that. Yeah. And water is one of the most basic things we need for survival. So naturally we're drawn to it. Even if you can't drink seawater, you can eat some of the tasty things that live in it. So yeah, no, I think that's a cool way of looking at it. I would totally agree with that.
Not an accident that you play guitar, because I'm just looking at what I wrote down here in our last conversation. You said guitar. So you're also a songwriter. You haven't written songs in a while. That's what I remember you saying. You said the
Yeah, I've
guitar.
probably written, I don't know, close to 70 or 80 songs maybe. But yeah, my main instrument's piano, but I also play mandolin and guitar.
So we just had Pacho Flores on, and he's a Venezuelan trumpeter, one of the premier trumpeters. I didn't know this actually when we reached out to him in the world. And
Hmm.
one of his missions is to bring Latin culture into classical trumpet music, trumpet sounds. Um, but anyway, we talked about strings and piano versus brass playing, and
Yeah.
he compared them both and how they. I think I told you this. I think I did.
You did, yeah, yeah, you did.
Well, so just the tip of the arrow then of that conversation I had with him is that he said strings and piano, string instruments and piano, you develop faster notes than brass because the the sound is made for you. You just have
Hmm.
to tap into how to use it. And then, so this is what you told me. I wanted to go back to what you said because it makes sense for me. What you've been saying all along here about your experiences is that you said that the guitar helps bring information into the world. It's the rhythm, and the guitar takes your body out of the process.
Yeah, I mean, what is music if it's not entering that creative flow state and tapping into the creative realm? You hear so many musicians talk about this, and not just musicians, but writers and visual artists, dancers, painters. You really kind of almost just give yourself up and become a conduit unto yourself. It's almost a form of mediumship unto itself, where you just allow the energy of the universe to flow through you. And I probably sound like a raging hippie right now, but that's what it feels like when you're creating. Because I also paint. I used to paint quite prolifically. I haven't for a while, much like I haven't written a song for a while, but you feel that same thing. If you're in that state, it's almost like you're not even controlling your body. You're feeling whatever that song is that's trying to come through, break on through to the other side, or the painting that
Nice.
wants you to hit the, yeah, sorry, that was a little cheesy, or the paintbrush to move in a specific way to blend these colors, and in a way that if you just thought consciously about it and took that out of the equation, then you wouldn't be able to make the same thing. So yeah, I've definitely felt that in creative pursuits over the years.
Have your creative pursuits amplified at all since these experiences have taken a more front seat in your life?
They probably would if I gave them the opportunity to.
Hmm.
I've just kind of pulled back from a lot of things I used to be very passionate about. Um, I don't know if that's related or not. Maybe it's also just time. I haven't had the time to do those things, or family, kids getting older. I don't know. I always say how much I'd like to, but then if I have some free time, I just don't. But it would be interesting to revisit it after, because I think anything that happens in people's lives changes the way that they interact with the world around them. So I, it's not that I've experienced anything like, life altering, but it's definitely changed the way I think about things like creativity and energy, and the relationship with, the physical reality that we find ourselves in. So yeah, it would be interesting to start writing songs and painting again to see kind of where it went.
So, if time weren't an issue, and money weren't an issue, you didn't have to earn it. You didn't have to worry about earning a living or having a career. Any of that. Put all of that aside. Where would you spend, and how would you spend your time?
I would split my time between the mountains and the beach.
Doing what?
But where that is, I don't know. Hopefully someplace that has both. I don't know. Probably the things that we're talking about that I just haven't had time to do recently. I think I would have a little studio with an easel set up and start using some of the 40 plus blank canvases I've accumulated over the years. Have instruments laying around and cool people to jam songs with. Because really, for me, music is playing with other people. It's having that shared communal space that almost feels like a hive mind flow state of sorts, where you're just kind of everyone giving up ego for that moment. And ironically, there's a lot of ego in bands, but in that moment where you're jamming together, you just kind of dissolve that and all interact in a really unique way. And I've felt that with a lot of other people over the years, and it's a really beautiful thing if you can find the right people to play with. So I think I would probably just hang out on the beach and drink pina coladas and jam tunes with people.
I have a place to recommend to you. Beach and mountains.
Hit me.
So it's a place in southern Italy called Praia Mare, and it's in Calabria, which is the toe of the boot. And I say it because we
Yeah.
have close family friends that are there. Shout out to Madeline. I'll send you the video that I took when I was there. It was the first time that I was there, and
Yeah, that'd be cool.
think of the distance between the mountains in right in this town and the beach is less than a kilometer, and call it
Hmm.
like 700 meters, 800 meters, whatever. We're on the third. She's on a high rise, I think it's 3 floors, and so she's on the balcony. She has an outdoor kitchen as well, so she's cooking dinner for us outside, and the kitchen, facing the kitchen, is a mountain. Just you looking straight up, left, right, mountains, an
Yeah.
ancient cave. There's an ancient church there too. I took this
Oh, cool.
video as the pasta was boiling and she was cooking. I think it was rabbit that night that we were having. Went around to the other side of the balcony is the sea. and it was absolutely stunning, just
Nice.
stunning. Yeah. Anyway, last
Yeah,
question, Mike.
that's
Sorry,
awesome.
I didn't want to bore you with that, but I'll send you the video if you
No,
still
no, I
think it's awesome.
appreciate that. I'd actually been trying to think about, yeah, I'd love to see it. I've been to northern Italy, but never central or south. So,
Different energy in the south. Very different. Very ancient. Very ancient. Um,
yeah, yeah, I've
last
heard that
question.
from a lot of people. It's cool.
Oh, I got lots of advice for you. We'll do it. We'll do that off camera. Um, again, last question.
All right.
Uh, what is greatness to you?
Um, man, I feel like I've already had so many hippy dippy answers. Um,
go go
I
with
think
what you feel.
this one has potential to go down one of those paths too. But I think greatness is being open uh to the world in a way that allows you to connect with other people and things, spaces, people in various places, and a willingness and desire to share something positive with them. And I think maybe, I guess I should clarify, I think that's more of a catalyst for greatness than greatness itself. Because I don't know if it's possible to achieve that in its truest form. But I feel like having that openness and empathy for others is one of the best ways to at least move in that direction.
Michael, thank you for your time. And I know you've been through a lot of what you said hundreds of times in other interviews, podcasts, but that's why I doubly appreciate this.
Well, I don't
Very
know.
cool of you.
Every conversation is different, and even when you do touch on things discussed before, there's always new ways to explore them with different people, and I feel like you and I took the conversation in different ways than it's gone before. So yeah, that I appreciate you having me on. This was a lot of fun for me as well.
Cool. Thanks again, man.